My husband smirked when I lost everything, told me failure was in my blood. I never mentioned the fortune I secured selling a hidden patent for $112 million. When he left for someone younger, I let him take it all. Months later, when the truth surfaced, he and his lawyer were speechless. Failure is in your blood, Valentina. Dominic spoke those words 3 months before he would leave me for Genevieve. But I remember that morning because it was the first time he'd said out loud what I'd suspected he'd been thinking for years. I was reviewing quarterly reports from my research department at Nexus Pharmaceuticals when I mentioned a funding cut. His response came swift and casual, delivered between sips of the espresso I'd made him at exactly 6:30 a.m., just the way he liked it. Our penthouse kitchen had become a stage for this daily performance. 3 computer screens lined the marble counter where Dominic tracked market futures, the Boston Harbor stretching behind him through floor-to-ceiling windows. I would stand at the espresso machine in my silk robe, already mentally preparing for my day at the lab, while he sat in his Italian leather bar stool, designer suit perfectly pressed, gold cufflinks catching the morning light. We moved through this routine with practiced precision, 2 actors who'd memorized their marks but forgotten they were supposed to be in love. The biotech sector is restructuring, I'd said that morning, trying to explain why my department's budget had been slashed again. It's happening everywhere. He looked up from his screens, really looked at me for the first time in weeks. Some people rise above market conditions, Val. Others get swept away by them. He turned back to his monitors. That's just genetics. I stood there holding the coffee pot, watching my husband of 5 years reduce my career to a matter of inferior DNA. The strange thing was I wasn't even surprised. This was simply Dominic being Dominic, viewing the world through spreadsheets and profit margins, measuring human worth in basis points and year-over-year returns. What he didn't know was that 3 years earlier, while he was sleeping off champagne from another record-breaking quarter, I'd been in my home office perfecting something that would change everything. My grandmother, Nonna Marconi, had died that year, leaving me an inheritance with a note written in her shaky handwriting. For your freedom, Cara, not for any man. It was only $40,000. But I'd used it to maintain the patent for an algorithm I'd developed during my doctoral work at MIT. The patent was filed under Valentina Marconi, my maiden name. I'd kept it in a shell company my grandmother's estate attorney helped establish, telling myself it was just smart planning. Every month, I'd pay the maintenance fees from an account Dominic knew nothing about. He managed our joint finances with the obsessive control of someone who believed money was the only real measure of success, but this one thing remained mine alone. The investment firm galas were where our marriage's power dynamic played out for public consumption. Once a month, we'd attend these elaborate affairs at the Four Seasons or the Ritz, rooms full of men in identical suits discussing identical portfolios while their wives smiled and pretended to care about market volatility. I'd try to contribute, mentioning breakthrough research in gene sequencing or new applications for molecular modeling, but the conversation would invariably shift. Valentina works with test tubes, Dominic would say with that particular smile, the one that made him look charming to everyone but me. I work with millions. The room would laugh. They always laughed. And I would stand there in my designer dress that Dominic had chosen, holding champagne I didn't want, smiling at a joke where I was the punchline. Marcus, Dominic's closest colleague, would sometimes try to show interest in my work, asking follow-up questions about pharmaceutical applications. But Dominic would steer the conversation back to safe territory: merger acquisitions, hedge fund strategies, the beautiful simplicity of compound interest. My wife's very bright, he'd tell people, the way you might describe a well-trained pet. MIT graduate, you know. But science doesn't exactly pay the bills. Another round of knowing chuckles from men who measured intelligence by annual bonuses. I started slipping away during these parties, finding quiet corners where I could check my phone for emails from companies interested in licensing opportunities. They didn't know who Valentina Marconi was yet, but they knew her algorithm could revolutionize how pharmaceutical companies process genetic data. The negotiations were still preliminary, careful exchanges through encrypted emails, but I could feel something building, like pressure before a storm. The night everything began to change was a Tuesday in October. Marcus had stopped by for drinks, lounging in our living room with its carefully curated art and harbor views. He was describing the firm's newest recruit, and I watched my husband lean forward with an intensity one hadn't seen since our early dating days. Genevieve Ashford, Marcus said, swirling his whiskey. Harvard MBA, top of her class. She's got that hunger, you know? That drive that makes you certain she'll either make partner in 5 years or die trying. Dominic's eyes lit up. When does she start? Monday. You're assigned as her mentor. My husband smiled and something cold settled in my stomach. It wasn't the mention of a young woman that bothered me. Dominic had mentored plenty of analysts before. It was the way he repeated her name like he was tasting something exotic and deciding he liked it. Genevieve Ashford. That's a name that belongs on a partnership letterhead. After Marcus left, Dominic couldn't stop talking about the importance of fresh perspectives, hungry talent, the need to cultivate the next generation. He paced our living room with an energy I hadn't seen in years, gesturing with his hands the way he did when he was truly excited about something. The firm needs people who understand the new landscape, he said. Someone who speaks the language of modern markets. Unlike me, who speaks the language of molecular structures? I asked, trying to keep my voice light. He paused, looking at me with that expression I'd grown to recognize. Part pity, part disappointment. You know, that's not what I meant. But we both knew it was exactly what he meant. I was the wife who'd been adequate when he was building his career, acceptable when he needed someone with enough credentials to impress at company events. Now that he'd made senior partner, now that he moved in circles where 8-figure deals were Tuesday afternoon conversations, I was beginning to look like what he'd probably seen all along. A starter wife, good enough for the climb but not for the view from the top. That night, I lay in our king-sized bed listening to Dominic's steady breathing and made a decision. The patent negotiations would continue, but faster now. The algorithm was ready, the market was hungry for it, and 3 companies were already circling with serious offers. My grandmother had been right about keeping something for freedom. I just hadn't realized until that moment that freedom might mean walking away from everything I'd built with a man who thought success in test tubes was somehow less valuable than success in stock portfolios. Tuesday morning started with my usual routine. Coffee at 6:30, emails by 7 o'clock, in the lab by 8 o'clock. I was reviewing data from our latest trial when my computer pinged at 9:47 a.m. The subject line was deliberately vague. Organizational update, action required. The email itself was 3 paragraphs of corporate doublespeak about strategic realignment and optimizing core competencies. The bottom line came in the final sentence. Effective immediately, the molecular research division was being eliminated. 8 years of my work, my entire team, our research into genetic markers for early disease detection, all deemed non-essential by executives who probably thought DNA was a stock ticker symbol. Security arrived at my office 20 minutes later. Not aggressive, just present, standing by the door while I packed my desk into a cardboard box they'd thoughtfully provided. My hands shook as I wrapped my MIT graduation photo in tissue paper. A security guard named Carl, who I'd chatted with every morning for 5 years, couldn't meet my eyes. "I'm sorry, Dr. Blackwood," he said quietly. "Orders from corporate." I wanted to tell him it wasn't his fault, but my throat had closed up. Instead, I focused on fitting 8 years into a box designed for office supplies. Research papers, awards, the coffee mug my team had given me that said, "World's Okayest Boss." Each item a small goodbye to a life I'd built paper by paper, experiment by experiment. My phone buzzed. "Dominic." I typed out, "Just got terminated. Mass layoffs." My fingers hovered over the keyboard, wanting to add more, needing reassurance, some indication that my husband would be the support system I desperately needed right now. His response came 30 seconds later. "We'll discuss tonight." 4 words. That's what 8 years of my career warranted. 4 words that sounded more like a business meeting agenda than comfort from the man who'd vowed to stand by me through better or worse. The walk to my car felt endless. Other employees were being escorted out too, all of us carrying our cardboard boxes like admission tickets to a club nobody wanted to join. Dr. Sarah Chin from immunology was crying silently. Robert from data analysis kept muttering about his mortgage. We avoided eye contact, each locked in our private devastation. I sat in my Honda for an hour in the parking garage, unable to start the engine. My phone rang twice. Both calls from biotech recruiters who'd somehow already heard about the layoffs, vultures circling before the body was cold. I let them go to voicemail. When I finally made it home, Dominic was in our bedroom, selecting cufflinks from his collection. The Hermes tie he was adjusting cost more than most people's car payments. He glanced at me in the mirror, taking in my red eyes and wrinkled blouse. Thornton client dinner, he said by way of explanation. Japanese executives. Can't reschedule. I stood in the doorway still holding my termination papers, waiting for him to turn around to actually see me. When he finally did, his expression was one of mild irritation, as if my personal crisis had inconveniently timed itself during his important evening. So, he said, straightening his collar. Nexus finally pulled the trigger. You knew. The words came out strangled. The whole street knew. Biotech's been hemorrhaging money for months. Your department was always going to be first on the chopping block. High overhead, minimal revenue generation. He said it so matter-of-factly, like he was analyzing any other failed investment. No acknowledgement that this failed investment was my life's work, my identity, my purpose for the past 8 years. 8 years, Dominic. I gave them 8 years. He sighed, the particular sigh he used when I was being unnecessarily emotional about something he considered purely logical. Then he walked over, placed his hands on my shoulders and looked me directly in the eyes. Failure is in your blood, Valentina. The words hung in the air between us. Not cruel, not angry, just stated as simple fact, like telling me I had brown eyes or Italian heritage. Some people are built for success, he continued, his hands still on my shoulders. Others work hard their whole lives and never quite break through. There's no shame in accepting your limitations. He kissed my forehead, a dismissive gesture disguised as affection, and went back to his cufflinks. I'll be late. Don't wait up. 2 nights later, I understood exactly how Dominic viewed my new unemployed status. He'd invited 8 colleagues for dinner, one of those impromptu gatherings he loved to host to demonstrate our perfect life. I spent 3 hours preparing Chilean sea bass with a saffron reduction I'd found in one of his approved cookbooks. Where's the brilliant scientist tonight? Marcus asked as I served the appetizers. Valentina's between opportunities, Dominic answered before I could speak. The phrase rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but his tone made it clear this was a permanent state rather than a transition. Actually, I'm exploring several options, I started to say, but Dominic cut me off. She's taking time to reassess her career trajectory. He smiled at his colleagues. Sometimes a setback is really an opportunity to recalibrate expectations. The men nodded sagely, as if Dominic had just delivered profound wisdom instead of reducing my professional identity to a failure that needed managing. I stood there holding a tray of canapés I'd spent an hour arranging, invisible except as evidence of my domestic capabilities. What kind of research were you doing? Asked James, a newer associate trying to be polite. Genetic markers for early cancer detection, I began. We were developing. Very technical stuff, Dominic interrupted, waving his hand dismissively. Not exactly dinner conversation. Val, could you check on the main course? I retreated to the kitchen, listening to them transition seamlessly into discussing market projections and acquisition strategies. Through the serving window, I watched my husband hold court, animated and confident, occasionally gesturing toward the kitchen when explaining that I was adjusting to the new reality. That night, after the guests left and Dominic had fallen asleep satisfied with his performance as the successful husband with the appropriately diminished wife, I locked myself in our guest bathroom with my phone. The marble countertop was cold against my legs as I sat cross-legged, whispering to a representative from Helix Dynamics. Dr. Marconi, your algorithm could revolutionize our entire data processing system, the voice on the other end said. We're prepared to make a substantial offer. I need absolute confidentiality, I whispered, paranoid that Dominic might wake up and wonder why I was making calls at 2 a.m. The patent is under my maiden name. This cannot be traced back to my married identity. Of course. Can we schedule an in-person meeting? I thought about my empty calendar, the days stretching ahead with nothing but job applications Dominic expected me to fail at and dinners where I'd be presented as the cautionary tale of aiming too high. Thursday 10 a.m., I said. The Starbucks on Massachusetts Avenue. Not the one near the financial district. As I scheduled more calls with competing companies, each conversation conducted in hushed tones while locked in various bathrooms and closets of my own home, I felt like a spy gathering intelligence in enemy territory. The enemy just happened to be sleeping in Egyptian cotton sheets in the next room, dreaming of whatever men dream of when they've successfully diminished their wives into manageable disappointments. The Thursday morning meeting at the Starbucks on Massachusetts Avenue had gone better than expected. The Helix Dynamics representative left with stars in his eyes after reviewing my algorithm's test data, and I walked out knowing an offer was imminent. For the first time since losing my job, I felt something resembling hope. That feeling lasted exactly 9 hours until I met Genevieve Ashford. The firm's spring gala was being held at the Mandarin Oriental, one of those events where everyone pretended charitable giving was their primary motivation for attending. I wore the black Versace dress Dominic had bought me 2 years ago, back when he still cared about presenting me as an asset worth displaying. He'd been distracted all week, constantly checking his phone and adjusting plans around someone else's schedule. I should have known. She materialized at the cocktail hour in a red Carolina Herrera dress that probably cost 3 months of what used to be my salary. Everything about her was calculated for maximum impact. The way the fabric hugged her athletic frame, the diamond studs that caught the light when she turned her head, the confidence that radiated from every gesture. She moved through the room like she owned it, and when she spotted us, her trajectory became a straight line. "You must be Valentina." Her handshake was firm, her smile practiced. "Dominic talks about you constantly." The way she said "constantly" made it clear these conversations weren't complimentary. Her eyes swept over me with the efficiency of someone cataloging assets and liabilities on a balance sheet. I could see her mental calculations: mid-30s, unemployed, wearing last season's dress, threat level, minimal. "Genevieve Ashford," she continued, though we both knew I already knew who she was. "I'm the new analyst Dominic's been mentoring. He's been absolutely transformative for my understanding of emerging markets." She launched into a discussion about Asian market volatility with the kind of passion I used to have when discussing RNA transcription. Dominic watched her with undisguised fascination, occasionally adding observations that made her laugh in a way that seemed both professional and deeply intimate. I stood between them holding a glass of champagne I didn't want, feeling like furniture that could think. "Harvard MBA, class of 2022, she mentioned casually when someone asked about her background. "But the real education comes from working with someone like Dominic. He sees patterns others miss." My husband preened under her attention. His whole posture changed when she spoke, shoulders back, chin up, the version of himself he presented when closing important deals. When another colleague joined our circle, Dominic's hand went to the small of Genevieve's back to guide her into the conversation. The gesture was brief, but I saw her lean into it almost imperceptibly. Over the next 2 weeks, Dominic's LinkedIn became a monument to mentorship. Every other post featured photos from their working lunches, at restaurants I'd never been to. There was Dominic and Genevieve bent over laptops at Mistral, their heads nearly touching as they reviewed spreadsheets. Another showed them at the Harbor Club, raising glasses to celebrate another successful client acquisition. In each photo their body language spoke volumes. The way she touched his arm when making a point, how he leaned in when she spoke, the shared smiles that suggested inside jokes I would never understand. Her comments on his posts were immediate and enthusiastic. Fire emojis preceded observations like, "This is why you're the best in Boston," and "Brilliant insight. Lucky to learn from the master." Meanwhile, my texts asking when he'd be home for dinner went unread for hours. When he did respond, it was always brief: "Running late," or "Client emergency," or simply "Don't wait up." I started checking her Instagram obsessively, looking for clues about their relationship. Her stories were carefully curated glimpses into a life of perpetual success. Morning workouts at Equinox, afternoon meetings in glass-walled conference rooms, evening cocktails at places that required reservations months in advance. Dominic appeared in more and more of them, always professional enough to avoid scandal but intimate enough to raise questions. Thursday, April 15th. I remember the date because it was the day my last shred of denial shattered. Dominic had been home for dinner, a rare occurrence that month, when his phone rang at 10:45 p.m. He answered immediately, his face shifting to concern. "Tokyo markets?" He was already reaching for his jacket. "No, you're right, we need to address this immediately. I'll meet you at the office." He kissed my forehead absently. "Crisis with the Yamamoto account. This could take all night." At 2 a.m., unable to sleep, I called his direct office line. It rang and rang before going to voicemail. I tried his cell, straight to voicemail. Then I remembered the location sharing we'd enabled years ago during a trip to Europe. Never disabled because we'd never thought to turn it off. My hands trembled as I opened the app. The pin showed him at the Ritz-Carlton downtown, not his office. My stomach turned to ice. I switched to Instagram and checked Genevieve's story from an hour earlier. A champagne glass against city lights, tagged at the Ritz-Carlton, captioned late night strategy session with champagne and sparkle emojis. I sat on our bathroom floor until dawn, phone in my hand, watching his location remain static at the hotel. He came home at 6 a.m., shirt untucked, looking tired but oddly energized. Long night. I asked from the kitchen where I'd been sitting with cold coffee. Exhausting. But we saved the account. He headed straight for the shower without meeting my eyes. Saturday morning, my mother appeared at our door unannounced. Ellen Marconi had a sixth sense for her daughter's misery. She took one look at my face, the dark circles, the hollow cheeks from barely eating all week, and pulled me into the kind of hug that made me feel 15 again. "Tell me," she said simply, guiding me to the couch. I told her about Genevieve, about the lunches and the late nights and the way Dominic looked at her like she was the answer to questions he didn't know he'd been asking. Mom listened without interrupting, occasionally squeezing my hand when my voice cracked. "Some men only see your value when it's gone, baby," she said when I finished. "Your father was the same way with his first wife. Didn't know what he had until she was building a new life without him." "This is different," I protested. "Dominic and we built something together." "You built something. He just lived in it." She stroked my hair the way she used to when I was young. "What are you going to do?" I almost told her about the patent then, about the meetings and the algorithm and the money that would soon make Dominic's portfolio look like pocket change. But something held me back. This secret felt too important, too powerful to share even with my mother. Some shields were too precious to lower even for family who loved you. "I don't know yet," I said instead. "But I'm working on something." She studied my face and I could see her recognize the determination there. The same look I'd had when pursuing my doctorate despite everyone saying biotech was too unstable for a career. "Good," she said. "Whatever you're planning, make sure it's for you, not against him. The best revenge is a life well lived, not a life spent seeking vengeance." My mother stayed for lunch after our conversation, making her famous pasta sauce while trying to lift my spirits with stories from her book club. After she left, I sat alone in our penthouse, staring at the harbor while my phone buzzed with another offer from a competing biotech firm. The number they proposed was staggering, but I needed time to think. That evening, Dominic came home earlier than he had in weeks. I should have known something was coming. He entered the living room with the kind of deliberate calm that preceded his most important presentations. The leather chair he chose to sit in had been his gift to himself after making senior partner, positioned perfectly to frame him against the harbor view. He crossed his legs, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at me with the detached professionalism he usually reserved for terminating underperforming employees. "Valentina, we need to have a conversation about our future." The words were measured, rehearsed. He had probably practiced them in his office, maybe even with Genevieve listening, offering suggestions on how to handle the soon-to-be ex-wife with minimal complications. I sat on the sofa across from him, the coffee table between us feeling like an ocean. "We've grown apart," he began, his hands clasped in that gesture he used when delivering difficult news to clients. "The person I was 5 years ago needed something different than what I need now. You're a brilliant woman, but we're on different trajectories." He spoke for 20 minutes without once meeting my eyes directly, his gaze focused somewhere just past my shoulder as if I were already a ghost. He used phrases like natural evolution and strategic realignment and optimizing our individual potential. When he mentioned Genevieve, it was with careful neutrality, describing her understanding of quarterly projections and merger strategies as if these were the qualities that mattered most in a life partner. "She speaks the language of my world," he said, finally looking at me. "You were always more comfortable in your laboratory than in boardrooms. There's nothing wrong with that, but I need someone who can match my pace, understand my ambitions." 5 years of marriage reduced to a performance review where I had failed to meet key performance indicators. I wanted to tell him about the calls I had been fielding, about the algorithm that would change an entire industry, about the money that would dwarf his precious portfolios. Instead, I sat silent, letting him think he was the one making the strategic decision. "When?" I asked when he finally stopped talking. I think it's best if we move quickly. Cleaner for everyone involved. The next morning at exactly 8 a.m. our doorbell rang. Harrison Whitfield stood in our entryway like an executioner in Armani, his briefcase containing documents that had clearly been prepared well in advance of Dominic's performance. Every detail had been considered, every asset catalogued, every term crafted to appear generous while ensuring Dominic retained everything of value. "Mrs. Blackwood," Whitfield said with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. "I'm here to discuss the dissolution paperwork. Mr. Blackwood has instructed me to be as generous as possible given your current employment situation." The emphasis on current made it clear he knew about my termination. They had probably discussed it at length, calculating how my unemployment strengthened their negotiating position. Whitfield spread the documents across our dining table, the same table where Dominic and I had hosted dinner parties, celebrated anniversaries, planned our future. "The terms are quite favorable," he explained, his manicured finger tracking through provisions. "Mr. Blackwood retains the penthouse as the mortgage is primarily serviced by his income. The Porsche, given its lease, is under his name. The investment accounts as they were funded entirely by his bonuses. You would retain your personal vehicle, clothing, jewelry received as gifts, and of course your personal belongings. My 9-year-old Honda and whatever I could fit in it. That was what 5 years of marriage had earned me in their calculation." Whitfield's smile suggested I should be grateful Dominic wasn't seeking spousal support from his unemployed wife. "I'll need to review this with my attorney," I said. "Of course. Though I should mention that Mr. Blackwood's offer is contingent on expeditious resolution. Prolonged negotiations would necessitate a less generous arrangement." Margaret Okonkwo's office occupied a corner suite overlooking Boston Common. She had built her practice on dismantling the egos of men who confused their net worth with their actual worth. When I explained my situation, she listened without interrupting, occasionally making notes in handwriting so elegant it looked like calligraphy. "Standard high-net-worth divorce tactics," she said when I finished. "He wants you to feel grateful for crumbs while he keeps the bakery." She reviewed Whitfield's documents with the kind of attention usually reserved for defusing bombs. "The terms are actually reasonable, given Massachusetts law and your current financial situation." "I want to accept them," I said, watching surprise flicker across her face. "But with one modification. I want an absolute mutual release clause. No future claims by either party, regardless of circumstances." Her pen stopped moving. She looked at me with the kind of scrutiny that had probably won her hundreds of cases. "That's unusually comprehensive. If you inherited money next week, won the lottery, or came into any windfall, he couldn't touch it. But the reverse is also true. If he makes partner, doubles his income, wins his own lottery, you get nothing." "Perfect," I said. "Make it ironclad. No loopholes, no exceptions, no matter what happens in the future." Margaret's fingers drummed against her desk, a habit when she was thinking through implications. "You're planning something." "I'm planning to move forward," I replied. "This clause ensures we both do so completely." She studied me for another moment, then nodded. "I'll draft language that would survive any challenge. But Valentina, once you sign this, that's it. No second chances, no buyer's remorse, no court in Massachusetts would overturn this level of mutual release." "I understand." The signing took place in Whitfield's conference room 3 days later. The space was designed to intimidate, all dark wood and leather-bound books that had probably never been opened. Dominic sat at the head of the table in his lucky deal closing suit, the one he wore when he knew he was winning. The smell of Genevieve's perfume clung to him like a victory flag. Whitfield presented the modified agreement with theatrical concern. "This mutual release clause is quite comprehensive, Mr. Blackwood. You're certain you're comfortable with these terms?" Dominic barely glanced at the provision. In his mind, I was a failed scientist with no prospects, no assets, and no future worth considering. "If it expedites the process, I'm fine with it." He signed with the flourish of someone closing a brilliant deal. As he pushed the papers toward me, I thought about the email on my phone from Helix Dynamics, their final offer that exceeded even my wildest expectations. My hand was perfectly steady as I signed my name, knowing that this signature was worth more than Dominic could possibly imagine. "Congratulations," Whitfield said with false solemnity. "You're now officially divorced." Dominic stood, adjusted his cuffs, and looked at me one last time. I hope you find what you're looking for, Valentina. I almost laughed. I had already found it. He just didn't know it yet. I walked out of Whitfield's conference room with divorce papers in my hand and freedom in my lungs. The elevator ride down from the 40th floor felt like descending from one life into another. By the time I reached the parking garage, I had already pulled up apartment listings on my phone. The performance of starting over needed to begin immediately. The Cambridge apartment I chose was perfect for my purposes. Second floor of a 3-story brownstone on a tree-lined street just off Massachusetts Avenue, close enough to MIT that professors and graduate students made up most of the foot traffic. The shop below sold used books and served mediocre coffee that somehow tasted better than anything from the expensive machines in the penthouse. The apartment itself was small. 1 bedroom, a living room that doubled as a dining area, and a kitchen where 2 people would have to coordinate their movements. The radiators clanged at night and the windows rattled when trucks passed, but it had exposed brick walls and original hardwood floors that creaked with character rather than age. I paid 3 months upfront in cash, telling the landlord, Mrs. Chin, that I was recently divorced and rebuilding. She patted my hand sympathetically and mentioned her own divorce 30 years prior. "You'll see," she said. "Freedom tastes better than security ever did." My Honda looked perfectly at home, parked directly in front of the building, visible to anyone walking by. I made sure to leave it there most days, occasionally moving it just enough to avoid tickets but always returning it to the same prominent spot. The narrative had to be consistent. Divorced woman, limited resources, starting fresh with whatever scraps her ex-husband had left her. The Whole Foods bag I carried up the stairs contained instant noodles, generic cereal, and the kind of wine that came with a screw top. Anyone watching, and I knew someone would be watching, would see exactly what they expected to see. What they wouldn't see were the documents I'd signed that morning at my attorney's office, finalizing the transfer of $112 million through a Byzantine structure of trusts and shell companies that would make the money essentially invisible until I chose to reveal it. My routine became deliberately public. Every morning at 8:30 I would walk to the Daily Grind, a coffee shop 3 blocks from MIT where biotech recruiters like to conduct informal interviews. I would claim the same corner table, spread out printed resumes and job postings, and highlight different sections with colored pens I'd bought specifically for this theater. The performance was exhausting in its attention to detail. "Another interview?" the barista, a grad student named Kevin, would ask sympathetically. "Third one this week," I'd reply with practiced weariness. "The market's tough right now." I conducted real phone interviews for positions I had no intention of accepting. My voice carried just enough to be overheard, discussing salary requirements that were reasonable but not ambitious, expressing enthusiasm about entry-level positions that were beneath my qualifications, thanking recruiters for considering me despite the gap in employment. Twice I recognized people from Dominic's circle, friends of friends who would undoubtedly report back about poor Valentina trying to rebuild her career after her husband traded her in for a newer model. James Yoshida called only on encrypted lines, only at predetermined times, his voice careful even through multiple layers of security. "The secondary transfers are complete," he would say. "The trust structure is now fully operational. And the paper trail? Non-existent. As far as any financial investigation would show, you're living on savings and whatever you can earn from job hunting." 3 weeks into my new life, on a Thursday evening when rain was turning the streets into rivers, Patricia Blackwood appeared at my door. Dominic's mother stood in the hallway holding a covered casserole dish and wearing the kind of sad smile that suggested she'd been building up to this visit for days. "I hope I'm not intruding," she said, though we both knew she wouldn't have come if she thought I'd turn her away. I invited her in, watching her take in the small space, the second-hand furniture I'd carefully selected from estate sales, the obvious downgrade from the penthouse where she'd spent countless holidays. She set the casserole on my tiny counter and pulled me into a hug that lasted long enough for both of us to pretend we weren't crying. "I raised him better than this," she whispered into my hair. We sat at my small kitchen table, the one I'd bought from a graduate student who was moving back to India, drinking tea from mismatched mugs while rain hammered against the windows. Patricia had aged in the weeks since the divorce, new lines around her eyes, a tremor in her hands that hadn't been there before. "I knew about her," she said suddenly. "Genevieve. I knew before you did." I stayed quiet, letting her unburden herself. He brought her to lunch at the club. Introduced her as his protégé, but I saw how they looked at each other. The way she touched his arm. The way he laughed at everything she said. Patricia stared into her tea. I should have warned you. I'm so sorry. It's not your fault, I said, meaning it. Dominic made his choices. Are you managing? She asked, looking around the apartment again. Financially, I mean. I could help. I'm fine, I assured her. Really? I have some interviews lined up and my savings will last a while. She wanted to believe me, needed to believe that her son hadn't completely destroyed me. I let her have that comfort, even as I thought about the meeting I had tomorrow at the Four Seasons, in a private room where numbers that would stagger her imagination would be discussed in whispers. Thomas Hashimoto, one of Yoshida's colleagues, specialized in wealth management for what he called ultra-high net worth individuals. He was waiting in the private dining room when I arrived, documents arranged on the table like a feast of possibilities. Ms. Marconi, he said, using the name that appeared on all the trust documents. We need to discuss investment strategies for your assets. For 2 hours we talked about diversification across markets, about offshore accounts in jurisdictions with favorable tax treaties, about structures that would generate income while maintaining complete anonymity. Every document I signed was under Valentina Marconi. The name Dominic had once said sounded too ethnic for Boston society. The name he'd suggested I drop professionally, now attached to more money than his entire firm managed. Your ex-husband, Hashimoto said carefully, has no way to connect you to these assets? He has no idea they exist, I replied. And legally, even if he discovered them tomorrow, he has no claim. The mutual release clause was quite comprehensive. Hashimoto smiled slightly. Then we proceed as planned. Your wealth remains invisible until you choose otherwise. Walking back to my apartment that evening, I stopped at the grocery store and bought more instant noodles, making sure the Whole Foods bag was visible as I climbed my stairs. The Whole Foods bag sat on my kitchen counter next to the bank statements I had been carefully leaving visible whenever anyone visited. 3 months had passed since the divorce, and my performance as the struggling ex-wife had been flawless. That Tuesday morning in late July, I prepared for what would be the beginning of the end of my carefully maintained illusion. The annual Boston Biotech Summit was being held at the Heinz Convention Center, and attending would be essential for maintaining my cover story of aggressive job hunting. I dressed carefully in my one remaining designer suit, the navy Armani I had kept because it interviewed well, and took the T rather than calling a car service. Every detail mattered in maintaining the narrative. The convention floor buzzed with the kind of energy unique to scientific conferences, part academic excitement, part corporate networking, part desperate graduate students trying to make connections. I registered under Dr. Valentina Blackwood, my professional name, and began making the rounds of recruitment booths, collecting business cards and brochures I would never need. The whispers started around noon. I was speaking with a recruiter from Genentech when I noticed her eyes shift past me, focusing on something behind my shoulder. Her expression changed subtly, the way people's faces do when they're trying to place important information. Excuse me, she said suddenly. But did you say your maiden name was Marconi? The question seemed innocent enough, but I could hear the undercurrent. Behind her, 2 executives from a competing firm were engaged in hushed conversation, their eyes occasionally darting in my direction. Yes, why do you ask? Oh, no reason. It's just, there's been talk about a major acquisition. Some revolutionary patent in genetic sequencing. The seller's name was Marconi. Such an unusual coincidence. I smiled pleasantly and changed the subject, but the damage was done. Throughout the afternoon, I could feel the weight of recognition spreading through the conference like ripples in water. Conversations would pause when I approached. People would whisper after I passed. By 3 o'clock, my phone had 17 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. That evening, I sat in my Cambridge apartment scrolling through Instagram when Genevieve's story appeared. She had posted a screenshot of the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office database, with certain sections highlighted. The caption read, "Interesting how some people preach transparency in relationships while hiding major assets. The truth always surfaces. #integrity matters, #financial honesty." The next several stories were more pointed. Screenshots of Massachusetts divorce law regarding asset disclosure. A photo of her and Dominic at dinner with the caption, supporting each other through deception and betrayal. Then, most tellingly, a picture of the Helix Dynamics building with 3 question mark emojis. She was getting close. Her network in the venture capital world had clearly been talking, connecting dots between the mysterious Marconi patent and Dominic's discarded ex-wife. I could imagine her frustration, trying to prove something she suspected but couldn't quite confirm. Wednesday afternoon, my phone rang while I was pretending to review job listings at the coffee shop. Marcus's name appeared on the screen, and I knew this call had been rehearsed, probably with Dominic listening in. Valentina, hi. I hope I'm not interrupting. His voice carried the forced casualness of someone trying very hard to sound natural. Marcus. This is unexpected. Yeah, well, I've been thinking about you. The divorce and everything. It must be tough, especially with the job situation. He paused, waiting for me to fill the silence with information. When I didn't, he continued. Listen, I know things ended badly with Dom, but we're still friends, right? If you need any help financially, I could probably arrange something. A loan or maybe even a position at one of our portfolio companies. The offer was so transparent I almost felt sorry for him. This was Dominic's attempt to gauge my financial situation, to confirm whether the rumors were just rumors or something more substantial. That's very kind, Marcus, but I'm managing fine on my savings. The job market is picking up. Savings? His voice cracked slightly. That's good. Must be nice to have that cushion. Though I imagine it won't last forever, especially in this city. I'm quite frugal these days. There was a long pause. I could practically hear him trying to formulate another approach, another way to extract information. Well, if anything changes, you have my number. I appreciate that, Marcus. After he hung up, I sat in the coffee shop for another hour, maintaining my routine even though my heart was racing with anticipation. The pieces were falling into place exactly as I had anticipated. The financial community was starting to connect the dots, but without confirmation, they were still operating on speculation and rumor. That evening, I opened my laptop and logged into the Marconi Biosystems email account that had remained dormant since the initial negotiations. It was time for the final move in this long game I had been playing. I composed a simple email to the head of public relations at Helix Dynamics. Dear Ms. Patterson, I hope this message finds you well. As we discussed during our initial negotiations, I have maintained a low profile regarding the patent acquisition. However, I believe it may now be appropriate to update your press materials to reflect the full name of the patent holder for accuracy and transparency. Please update all references from Dear V. Marconi to Dear Valentina Marconi Blackwood. Thank you for your continued discretion in this matter. Best regards, Dr. Valentina Marconi Blackwood. I hit send and closed the laptop. Within hours, maybe less, the updated information would appear in Helix Dynamics press materials. Their next quarterly report would include the full name. The connection between the mysterious patent holder and Dominic's discarded ex-wife would become undeniable. I made myself a cup of tea and sat by my window, looking down at Mass Avenue as students and professors hurried past in the summer evening light. My phone buzzed with another Instagram notification from Genevieve. Another desperate attempt to piece together a puzzle that was about to solve itself. Tomorrow or the next day, Dominic would learn what his assessment of my worth had cost him. He would discover that while he had been calculating my limitations, I had been building an empire he never knew existed. The woman he had deemed a failure, whose blood supposedly carried the genetic markers of mediocrity, had been sitting on a fortune that dwarfed his entire career's earnings. I thought about Patricia, his mother, and her sad eyes when she had visited. I thought about Marcus and his transparent fishing expedition. I thought about all the dinner parties where I had been dismissed as the woman who worked with test tubes while real success was measured in portfolios and profit margins. The truth was about to surface, and I found myself surprisingly calm. The calm didn't last long. Thursday evening arrived with a summer storm that turned Cambridge into a water painting. Rain streaming down my windows in sheets that distorted the world outside. I was reading a medical journal, keeping up with developments in my field despite my supposed unemployment, when my phone vibrated on the coffee table. Dominic's name on the screen felt like a prophecy fulfilling itself. I let it ring 3 times before answering, giving myself time to center my breathing and prepare for what was coming. Valentina. His voice was different. Gone was the confident tone that had commanded boardrooms and dinner parties. This was raw, uncertain, almost desperate. Hello, Dominic. The patent. The Helix Dynamics acquisition. It's you, isn't it? Valentina Marconi Blackwood. There was no point in denial now. The press release had been updated that morning. By noon, the financial blogs were running stories about the mysterious patent holder who had revolutionized genetic sequencing algorithms. By 3 o'clock, someone had connected the dots between Dr. Valentina Marconi Blackwood and the recently divorced wife of senior partner Dominic Blackwood. Yes. The silence stretched between us, filled only by the sound of rain against glass and his ragged breathing on the other end of the line. $112 million. He said each word separately as if trying to make sense of their combination. You had $112 million when we divorced. No, I had a patent when we divorced. The sale was finalized 2 weeks after you signed the papers. That's semantics. You were in negotiations. You knew what it was worth. You sat there in that conference room and let me think. His voice broke slightly. You let me believe you had nothing. I let you believe what you had already decided to believe. That I was a failure. That my work with test tubes, as you so eloquently put it, would never amount to anything significant. This isn't fair. We were married for 5 years. That patent, that work, it happened during our marriage. I have rights. You have exactly what you negotiated for. The penthouse, the Porsche, the investment accounts, and a mutual release clause that prevents either of us from making any future claims on the other's assets. Your attorney called it overprotective, remember? You said you didn't care as long as it expedited the process. I could hear him moving, probably pacing his office or the penthouse that used to be ours. Then came the sound of a door closing and muffled voices. Genevieve was with him, of course. We need to talk about this in person, he said. I'm coming over. It's nearly midnight, Dominic. I don't care. We need to resolve this. The line went dead. I sat in my small living room listening to the rain and waiting. I didn't change out of my pajamas or try to make myself presentable. There was something powerful about meeting him exactly as I was, no longer performing the role of appropriate wife or desperate divorcee. The doorbell rang at 12:17 a.m. Through the peephole I could see Dominic standing in the hallway, rain-soaked despite the short walk from his car. Behind him, at the edge of my vision, Genevieve waited on the stairs, probably stationed there to provide backup or witness whatever she imagined would happen. I opened the door but didn't invite him in. He stood in my doorway, water dripping from his coat onto the worn hallway carpet. In his hands was a manila folder that he clutched like a lifeline. May I come in? No. He seemed surprised by the directness of my refusal. In 5 years of marriage I had rarely denied him anything so flatly. Valentina, please. Be reasonable. We can work this out. He opened the folder, revealing documents covered in legal language. My attorney drew these up. A post-divorce settlement modification. We can share the proceeds from the patent. 50-50. That's more than fair considering. Considering what? That you divorced me? That you took everything you wanted? That you told anyone who would listen that failure was in my blood? His face flushed, though whether from shame or anger I couldn't tell. I was going through something. Genevieve and I, it wasn't supposed to happen that way. But this isn't about her. This is about what's fair. Fair. I tasted the word, found it bitter. Was it fair when you introduced me at parties as your unemployed wife who was between opportunities? Was it fair when you said I wasn't built for the rooms you walked into? I didn't mean. He stopped, collected himself, tried another approach. The penthouse. I'll give it back. The car too. Everything I took in the divorce, you can have it all back. Just share the patent money. I looked at him standing there, reduced to bargaining with someone he had discarded as worthless just months ago. Behind him I could see Genevieve had moved closer, no longer content to wait in the shadows. The patent was filed before we married, I said, keeping my voice steady despite the adrenaline flooding my system. It was maintained with my grandmother's inheritance. Money you never knew existed because you never asked about my family's finances beyond what appeared in our joint accounts. And it was sold after our divorce was finalized. You have no legal claim to it. Legal technicalities, he said, his voice rising. You know this isn't right. You deceived me. I protected myself. There's a difference. That's when Genevieve lost her composure. She pushed past Dominic into my apartment, her designer heels squelching with rainwater, mascara running down her face in black rivers. "You manipulative witch," she screamed, raising her hand as if to slap me. I caught her wrist gently but firmly, feeling her arm shake with rage. "He chose you for your ambition," I said quietly, looking directly into her eyes. "I chose silence for my freedom. We both got exactly what we planned for." She jerked her hand away, stumbling backward into Dominic, who caught her reflexively. "You'll regret this," she said, her voice breaking. "We'll make sure everyone knows what you did." "What did I do exactly? Filed a patent under my legal name? Maintained it with my own money? Sold it after my divorce? Which part of that would you like to make public?" Dominic pulled Genevieve back toward the door, his face a mask of defeat. At the threshold he turned back one last time. "I loved you once," he said quietly. "No," I replied. "You loved the idea of me. The MIT graduate who made you look progressive. The scientist wife who proved you were intellectually sophisticated. But you never loved me, Dominic. If you had, you would have known I was capable of this." I closed the door on both of them, listening to their footsteps fade down the stairs. Through my window I watched them get into his Porsche, Genevieve gesticulating wildly while Dominic sat still behind the wheel. Eventually they drove away, red taillights disappearing into the rain-soaked night. I stood in my small apartment, surrounded by second-hand furniture and the carefully constructed props of my supposed poverty, and felt nothing but peace. Tomorrow there would be lawyers and threats and social media posts designed to shame me. But tonight, in the quiet aftermath of confrontation, I had won simply by refusing to apologize for protecting myself. The rain continued to fall, washing the city clean. I returned to my apartment after closing the door on Dominic and Genevieve, but sleep never came. Instead, I sat by the window watching the rain gradually lighten to a drizzle, then stop altogether as dawn broke over Cambridge. By morning I had made a decision. The performance of poverty had served its purpose. It was time to stop hiding. 3 months later, in October, I received an invitation printed on cardstock so thick it felt like armor. Helix Dynamics was hosting their quarterly board meeting and wanted me to present my algorithms applications to their directors and key investors. The presentation would be held in their flagship conference room, with an audience that included some of Boston's most influential biotech and financial leaders. I dressed carefully that morning in a new suit, charcoal gray and perfectly tailored, purchased with money I no longer needed to hide. My apartment in Cambridge had been exchanged for a Beacon Hill brownstone, though I had kept the transition quiet, moving my few possessions on a Sunday when the streets were empty. The Helix Dynamics boardroom was 40 floors up, with windows that turned Boston into a chessboard of buildings and ambition. As I set up my presentation, executives began filing in, and I recognized several faces from Dominic's firm. Richard Thornton, the managing partner who had once condescended to me at dinner parties. James Mitchell, who had laughed the loudest when Dominic joked about my test tubes. And in the back row, trying to remain inconspicuous, Marcus, who had called weeks ago fishing for information about my finances. "Ladies and gentlemen," the CEO began, "it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Valentina Marconi, whose pioneering algorithm has positioned Helix Dynamics at the forefront of genetic medicine. Her work will fundamentally change how we approach disease detection and treatment." I stood before them, no longer the unemployed wife they had dismissed, and walked them through applications of my algorithm that would save lives and generate profits they could barely imagine. I watched Richard Thornton's face as the implications became clear, saw him doing the mental math of what $112 million meant in terms of my net worth versus his. "Dr. Marconi," Thornton said when I finished, his voice carefully modulated, "this is remarkable work. I believe you were previously married to one of our senior partners." "Previously," I confirmed, meeting his gaze directly. "Though I'm sure Dominic has moved on to better things." The room grew quiet. Everyone knew the story by now, how Dominic Blackwood had divorced his wife for a younger woman just weeks before learning about her 9-figure patent sale. 2 weeks later, the Children's Hospital annual fundraiser transformed the Four Seasons Ballroom into a constellation of Boston's medical and financial elite. I attended as a platinum sponsor, my name listed prominently in the program alongside established philanthropist families who had been donating for generations. I saw them before they saw me. Dominic and Genevieve stood near the silent auction tables, his hand resting on her back in that possessive way I remembered. Her engagement ring caught the light when she moved, modest by the standards of the room, certainly smaller than the one Dominic had given me 5 years ago. He looked older, grayer around the temples, his shoulders carrying a weight that hadn't been there before. The whispers followed them like smoke. I heard fragments as I moved through the room. Monumental misjudgment. Could have been set for life. She was worth how much? Dominic's colleagues gave him a wide berth, their greetings perfunctory, their eyes already searching for more promising conversations. Our eyes met across the room as I accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server. For a moment time seemed to pause. I saw him take in my appearance. The designer gown, the confidence that no longer needed to be manufactured, the small circle of admirers discussing the scholarship fund I had just announced. I raised my glass slightly, not in mockery but in acknowledgement. We had both gotten exactly what we had chosen. He turned away first, guiding Genevieve toward the exit. They left before dinner was served. A month later, my mother's 70th birthday brought our entire extended family to my Beacon Hill brownstone. The house was everything our old penthouse hadn't been: warm, lived in, filled with photographs and memories rather than status symbols. My cousins explored the library while their children played in the garden, and my aunts commandeered the kitchen to prepare enough food for a small army. "I need to tell you all something," I said when we gathered for dinner. The dining room, with its restored crown molding and windows overlooking the private garden, felt like a sanctuary. I told them about the patent, about the money, about keeping it secret through the divorce. Some were shocked, others angry that I hadn't trusted them earlier, but my mother simply smiled. "My daughter," she said, raising her wine glass, "who knew when to speak and when to stay silent. Who built her success not on anyone else's foundation but her own. To Nana Marconi," I added, "whose inheritance made it all possible. The scholarship fund I'm establishing at MIT will be in her name, 4 female students pursuing graduate degrees in biotechnology." That night, after everyone had gone home and the house was quiet, I sat in my study overlooking the Charles River. The room smelled of leather and old books, nothing like the sterile office in the penthouse. I pulled out a piece of my new stationery and began writing. "Dominic, you were right about one thing. We did speak different languages. Yours was about taking, mine was about building. You measured success in acquisitions, I measured it in discoveries. You saw my work as test tubes and failures, I saw it as the foundation of a future you couldn't imagine. The fortune you never knew I had was never really about the money. It was about knowing my worth when you couldn't see it, protecting my future when you dismissed it, and finding peace in the truth that the best revenge isn't served cold. It's served with perfect documentation and the patience to let people reveal exactly who they are. I don't hate you. I'm grateful. Your inability to see my value taught me to never again let anyone else define it for me." I folded the letter, sealed it in an envelope, and locked it in my desk drawer where it would remain forever unsent. Some words were meant to be written but never delivered, truths that needed to exist without being shared. Outside, Boston glittered in the darkness. A city full of ambition and dreams and people trying to prove their worth to others who would never truly see them. But in my study, surrounded by the life I had built with patience and precision, I finally understood that the only person whose approval I had ever needed was my own. Valentina's flawless revenge kept you hooked until the last page. Smash that like button right now. My favorite part was when Dominic realized too late that the fortune had always been in her name. What was your favorite moment? Drop it in the comments below. Don't miss more gripping stories of betrayal and triumph. Subscribe and tap the notification bell so you never miss an upload, 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 so you never miss